Good afternoon. My name is Matt Zacher. I'm with the APQC and I'd like to welcome you to our webinar. I'd like to, just for your information, for the speakers today will be myself, and I'm a project manager here with APQC. Jeff Varney, who's the Director of Advisory Services, Lisa Fairbanks, who is with the AWS team, head of their customer experience solutions, and Jason Yung, who's a principal analyst. In the agenda for today's call, we'll go through our methodology for the study, cover respondent profile, key findings and takeaways, and then we'll have time at the end for questions. But if there are questions throughout the presentation, if you'd like to either raise your hand or put them in the chat, we'll try to answer them as we go, or we may, depending on what it is, we could hold it to the end. So for the why we did this survey, I'd like to introduce the AWS team. So Jason, you want to take it away?
Yes, certainly. So thanks off everyone for joining on this webinar on Customer 360. And to kind of set the scene, I sit in an area within Amazon Web Services that really helps to understand the customer business value drivers and the use cases that are powered by analytics. So when we talk to customers, we really, are trying to understand the voice of their customers, and that's what you see there on the left. And through the workshops that we perform, that we call data-driven everything, we are trying to solve for their customer problem. And a lot of the problems tend to be on understanding that unified view of their customers, understanding what the attributes are in terms of what they're spending on their account, spending as a part of their household. So very much that's been, front and center, a very big trend that we're hearing from our customers. But on top of that as well, we're finding that this customer 360 use case is quite prevalent in the way in which services have been developed within Amazon Web Services. So for instance, Amazon Connect launched customer profiles, which is a service that helps to unify that customer data attributes. And that was only launched around about 1.5 years ago, but we're seeing increased demand to unify that, not only in the call center, but also using that services in areas outside of the call center within that organization. We also see that we're partnering quite a lot more with customer data platforms on the AWS marketplace, and the signals that we're hearing from customers wanting to provision those customer data platforms, or CDPs, is becoming more and more popular. And last but not least, our internal requests from our sales teams have spiked for customers wanting to unify their customer profile. So very much, hearing from the voice of AWS customers, we're finding that it is something that customers want. But Lisa, what are you hearing from the forces that are driving need?
Yeah, so I mean, outside of all of the internal signal that we were getting, then we kind of translate that into what are we hearing directly from customers. So we were getting a lot of internal signal, and all of the examples that Jason just gave you on the need for this discussion, where does AWS fit? But the reasons for that really varied, right? All the way from, AWS customers are not immune to all of the changes that are happening with browsers, with regulations, with the implementations that, Apple has recently done on app tracking. That was definitely core and center to the impetus for having these conversations and driving this demand. We were also hearing from customers outside of just the regulatory side of things. They're looking for growth that would come from customers, right? There's obviously growth that can come from customers or acquiring new customers, and they seem to be very focused with regards to what's the growth of my existing customer. And that necessarily means I need to know that customer very intricately well in order to drive that growth, including additional services I might need to develop. Another use case that we heard really often, or we continue to hear, is the sharing of data across lines of business, across brands. This is particularly a trend that we see for CPG companies. They need to be able to share this data and really scale. I've got, data with one brand. How can that data be used with another brand so that we can really kind of use the collective force of all of this information to drive efficiencies within each brand? And then the last kind of pillar, I would say, with regards to in terms of these core needs, was this desire and this need to take more control of first-party data. This seems to be kind of the underlying theme in many cases recognizing that, you know, organizations, this is very competitively differentiating data that you don't necessarily want sitting outside of your organization, and really trying to take actual real steps and movements to get and acquire that data and build the skill set internally. So those are like probably for the most common driving forces that were driving the internal signal around discussions, and then obviously discussions with AWS customers. And kind of on this idea of taking more control of first-party data, we'd like to just throw up for everybody a quick survey. Again, in our discussions with customers, there really is this desire around either I'm going to allow a third-party application. You can go ahead and switch the slides there, Matt. I'm going to allow for a third-party application to, you know, kind of collect this data and store it. Or a lot of them are in the process of taking on that ownership themselves. So we will share with you the results of what our survey, we asked this very specific question in the benchmarking study around which statement best describes how your organization is asserting, if at all, more direct control of first-party data. We'll share with you what the benchmarking study said, but before that, we'd love to just post up a quick survey of our attendees today and see where you sit on this scale. Jason, what are you hearing with regards to first-party data and some of the kind of needs and challenges that customers are having?
Yeah, it's a really good point. I think there's definitely a sense from customers that they don't really know where their first party data is in the first place. So around kind of driving value with the data, they don't even understand where that type of data is that really informs what their customers are doing. So they're looking at ways in which they can take control of their data, but ideally, you know, having a platform or building a platform that can discover that data for them. So, you know, there's very much a discovery piece around first-party data. But on top of that as well, there's this understanding of even if you unify that data, there's not necessarily a plan on what the use cases are that actually underpin how to drive value from that data. So very much the kind of classic discussion around you want to unify your data, you want to put that into a data platform, but then what next? And that's what we're hearing very much from customers, and they're trying to understand is, well, what are you hearing as signals, AWS, around those use cases? And what you'll find, you know, during the conversation today is that we've unpacked a little bit about those use cases, understanding what really drives at the heart of using this first-party data for their business purposes.
For sure. It's very kind of field of dreams, build it and they will come, right? We'll build the 360 and then we'll decide what we do with it, but you really need to be more purpose-driven than that. So I think, so Nikki, are you able to kind of share with us the results of our poll? So it looks like for our attendees, I think we'll have a very comparable view with regards to what our benchmarking study showed as well. Those who are kind of in the process of doing more very deliberate collection of their first-party data. So thanks for everyone who participated there. So next slide. So again, this is what our benchmarking study found. I'm sorry, let's go ahead. Let's talk about benchmarking as a whole. So I'll hand this over to Matt.
Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, the slides aren't necessarily responding as fast as I'd like. So why do we benchmark? You know, this is one of APQC's prime functions, but you know, it's to go ahead and evaluate internally, but we also look externally and to get a level of playing ground and get an idea of what we're doing and why we're doing it, right? So, you know, it helps drive innovation. It helps create a sense of urgency within your organization, because if you go out and benchmark externally and you find that you're lagging industry leaders or something like that, it's like, hey, we need to make a change here. So it again, and then you know that also goes into the overcoming the complacency. You know, you don't want to just sit back on your laurels and let the market get away from you. And well, also from doing the external benchmarking, it helps you see what others are doing, and it helps move that out of the box thinking. So that's really some of the high points. I mean, we do, obviously, like I said, APQC does a ton of benchmarking. There's a lot of reasons for it, but those are the main highlights. Okay. All right. Sorry about that. So again, we're jumping around here, but so who did we go out and look to learn from in this particular study, you know, or the profile requirements? Obviously, we wanted to study organizations that had implemented the customer 360 of at least 1 year, looking at executive and senior leadership, director level or above, that had a good range of control or span of control or area of responsibility. And then the minimum of 5 systems that they were using. And then also we had a revenue qualification of over 500 million. So with those criteria, we had approximately 300 respondents. It's just a real quick down of, our industry breakdown was fairly evenly distributed throughout. We didn't have any one particular area dominate the answers. And then from location and span of control, we did have a pretty good global footprint. Lacked a little bit in the Latin America, but other than that, it's primarily North America. And then, also with a fairly large global footprint. So then, we're going to some of the outcomes from a methodology. We were looking at, the before and after of several business outcomes, and then also the operational efficiencies. We're going to get into those a little bit more. But Lisa, do you have anything you want to add on this before we start to go into some more of the numbers?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, the approach that we took here was really important, because when we have conversations with customers, when they do have use cases, those use cases span, a myriad of different domains. And they can, range from building lookalike models to improving campaign effectiveness, right? Those kind of sitting in the marketing bucket. And then you've got those around service, on resolving customer issues. The ability to measure and understand customer intent. So, when we think about all of the KPIs, so if I'm a business and I'm trying to understand what is the business outcome or what's the business value I'm going to take or gain out of implementing or having a unified view of the customer, it's really a really large gamut of potential KPIs I might be impacting there. And depending on the function that you're speaking with, they really care obviously about, attribution if I'm in marketing, cost to serve if I'm in support, et cetera, et cetera. So our approach here was to really think about what if I had to aggregate this up, and even KPIs that might be shared across domains. That was really important in our benchmarking, because then we recognize that, you will have multiple, hopefully, functional teams working together on building a unified view of the customer. So the business outcomes themselves, they're broad. They're somewhat aggregated, but again, we kind of kept this in mind because the number of use cases for having a unified view are really almost limitless. Not quite yet. I want to go back. And then the other was around the operational efficiencies. We cannot underscore enough that even though there's opportunities for improving customer lifetime value, driving improved profit margin, all of those things, customer satisfaction, net promoter scores, all of those metrics that you really do care as a business, there are a lot of opportunities for operational efficiencies that also come along with having this unified profile of the customer. And we didn't want to let that go, because the more efficiently you're able to answer a customer's question, the more efficiently you're able to get a new product or service to market, those represent real tangible business value as well. So there were 17 different KPIs we looked at. This is the list of them, but I just wanted to clearly delineate why we have business outcomes in one category and then the operational effectiveness and the return there in the other. All right, next slide.
Okay, so what we have here is some of the overall information that we achieved or we collected through the study, and what we found and what was quantifiable. So I mean, you can see that with almost all of, actually all the ones on this slide, all the KPIs that we looked at, that there was an improvement after the implementation of a Customer 360 platform. And depending on industry and which KPI there was, obviously there was variation, but we're going to get into that a little bit later. But you can see the lifetime value was increased quite significantly after implementation. And then on the some of your other KPIs where you see the negatives, that's we wanted the cost to solve requests to go down and customer churn to decrease. So those are all like an overall quick look at all the KPIs.
Yeah, and then I just think I'd like to kind of earmark or kind of talk about some of these that I found personally interesting. So Customer satisfaction, net promoter score, those can sometimes be highly, subjective. If you do surveys and those surveys are executed at certain times in the customer journey. So I kind of expected those to be relatively high. Again, there's just some subjectivity with regards to even who completes those surveys or even those NPS type of things. The two that really caught my attention, though, because I expected them to be higher. The first was return on marketing. So this was a metric specifically around return on marketing spend. And the reason why I thought that one was interesting, it's lower than I expected. And the reason it's lower is because, and Jason, you can interject here too, and what you hear, many times with AWS customers, the marketing is where this conversation starts, right? And we will talk a little bit later in the webinar around the role that customer data platforms play in this. And that kind of is somewhat the legacy of why this often starts in a marketing conversation. But I expected, because marketing is so kind of inherently drawn to this unified view and what can they do with that data and how can they then use it for the purposes of having more effective campaigns, I expected the return on marketing to be a little bit higher. That said, I would assume, or my kind of inference here, the reason why it isn't is somewhat related to attribution. Like, we recognize that the more touch points that a customer or a prospect can engage with, the harder it is to really do attribution with regards to what is the source of that opportunity, that marketing spend, et cetera. So I think that it's lower, but I think that might be just a case with regards to it's hard to do attribution within marketing. The other one that I found, go ahead, Jason.
Yeah, no, I definitely echo that. And I think, for those who are on the call, particularly who are, on the marketing side of things, it's quite clear that the maturity around MarTech, regardless of a customer data platform, has been quite good. So if you might be operating Salesforce and you've got really effective CRM campaigns where you're reducing your cost to acquire, then putting in a customer 360 will give you better returns. But as a stepwise scale, as a percentage, it may not be as high as the other ones that you're seeing here, because you've already matured that level of thinking. You already know how to hyper target certain customers to be able to convert them into a purchase using an e-commerce example. But I think what we really are seeing here is that the other metrics here, particularly around if you were to span a customer's lifetime value, how many repeat times they actually land back onto the platform, that's something that you may not necessarily measure initially from a marketing KPI, such as conversion rate. But when you look at customer lifetime value, that's more around understanding, as a customer, is presented with a more relevant offer time and time again, they're going to be more sticky. So we're finding that the more longer term KPIs, the ones that businesses really care about as a long-term strategy cycle, those are the ones that we're seeing bigger uplift in. Whereas return on marketing, which tends to be kind of a finite point in time, you're not going to see that immediate uplift. And that's just maybe something to differentiate, is that the longer you extrapolate these KPIs, the more it benefits on the top row that you're seeing there and those big wins.
Yeah. Anything else in this that you found interesting, Jason, or other data that you expected to see maybe tilted the other direction and or not quite as significantly as it did?
Yeah, look, I think what's quite clear is that based on the profiles of the businesses that we are highlighting, particularly where we're looking at enterprise level, which is 500 million and above, it is quite clear that they probably have pretty good technology stacks there. So as such, we are seeing that the lower numbers are kind of related to an extent with technology, but the higher numbers that you're seeing with average order value, those are the ones that are more, where you have domain experience. How do you target your customers better? Those are things that you can't necessarily solve with technology, but we're finding that those are the ones that have been bubbled up. And I think that plays a part in terms of the next slide, in terms of operational efficiencies. So if you want to skip to that next slide, the operational efficiencies is actually quite interesting, right? So when you're thinking about trying to do something around targeting a particular customer, right now, your time to value might be quite long because you're asking your data analytics or your data science team to prepare the data to be able to serve the CRM campaign and, using machine learning. So what we're finding as the biggest benefit here is the reduction of the time spent on data preparation. But then you think about the flip side of it, and then you actually think about all those KPIs that we saw before. If you're asking your data science teams to focus less on doing the data preparation, then they might then be able to focus on other things such as customer lifetime value. So we can't just say that the customer lifetime value uplift of 21% is purely on putting in the Customer 360 as a technology platform. It's also the operational benefits by freeing up your skilled resource to be able to focus on the things that matter. And that is probably what you're also finding as common themes here is that every single part of these KPIs here is about time. It's about the ability for you to extrapolate the insights quicker so that you can impact on your customer experiences faster, but also you can really reuse the efforts within the organization to focus on other things as well. And I think that flip side is something that a lot of customers, particularly when we talk with Customer 360, they don't really fully think that that is their focus, but as they understand that more, they realize, yes, that is exactly what we're looking for. And I think that's where, hopefully as you go down this Customer 360, I guess, lifecycle with your own customers and with your own organization, you'll be able to focus more on operational effectiveness as something that may not necessarily be front and center within your business stakeholders, but it hopefully will become more evident as you discuss this and discuss all the different options.
And I'm just catching something here, Jason. That last on the top line towards the right, the 54.5%, time to deliver insights, that actually it's been cut off a little bit, but that is time to deliver insights to frontline employees. And I think that aligns almost perfectly with what you just said. The more time that my data scientists can spend getting the insights that a seller needs in order to service an account, that someone in a retail shop can, kind of service that customer there, kind of in person or to the call center so that they can service the customer. That metric is very, very compelling. Obviously, it's one of the top metrics with regards to time improvements and time to deliver insights to frontline employees so that they can then service the customer. So I think it's a great correlation to what you're just talking about with not spending as much time on the prep and actually doing value-added activities.
Exactly. Lisa, that
right.
also, excuse me, Jason, I was going to say that also correlates to the previous page where it talked about better customer experience, net promoter scores, et cetera, because ultimately the customer is getting faster response time, more targeted and correct interaction, which drives their satisfaction overall.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. One thing that I'll probably point out before we move on here is that, then the maturity of what you put into your Customer 360 is based on the data attributes. And to the point that we talked about, a lot of companies don't really know where their customer data is, particularly when it comes to negative, sentiment on data. So for the most part, a lot of use cases that customers talk to us about is about how do we drive better customer experiences. But adversely as well, when customers are disappointed when they don't get the delivery on time, then we also need to be able to uncover negative sentiment. Now, the reason why the first call resolution rate may not necessarily be as high is not because of the ineffectiveness of the Customer 360 implementation, but it could equally be that the data is not piped in correctly. And that is so important around the ability for you to understand how your data is produced into the platform and the context behind that. And hopefully, as we go through the next few slides, you understand why it's important not to treat this as a silver bullet, being able to plug and play. There are certain things that you need to think about and having some control over this platform that allows you to get the biggest wins.
Absolutely. So, I mean, this next slide was really just to kind of, there were some, as we talked about at the beginning, Matt shared, there were several industries that we studied. A lot of them, you could argue, are more consumer facing. And by far and away, that is absolutely where AWS sees a lot of the momentum. That said, I would say over the last 6 to 12 months, there's definitely been a pivot with regards to outside of the customer 360, kind of that account 360. So we just wanted to share with you some of the kind of very, industry specific benchmarks that we found and why these, kind of maybe speak to why some of these industries are doing what they're doing. Specifically as relates to telecom, the one that really caught my attention on the KPIs is the campaign execution time. I actually worked for Verizon Wireless in a marketing function many, many years ago. And went through the very painful process of having to learn how to write SQL statements and join tables together in order to understand something very unique about a customer. And it was laborious. It was very time consuming just to run, kind of run those SQL statements and pull the data back. And the need to execute, identify an opportunity and execute a campaign, that was just not something that was in our makeup. So I would say that this idea with regards to telcos really seeing a lot of value add as it relates to the execution time of a campaign. I find that to be remarkably profound and very critical, particularly at the speed at which the telco businesses are moving. Jason, any other insights you have for some of these other industries and where we found some of their improvements?
Yeah, I think it wouldn't be surprising for people to kind of see that, healthcare and retail is really bubbled up, particularly on the healthcare side, because traditionally you wouldn't think that there are customers related to healthcare. But if you stretch out, healthcare and life sciences to, pharmaceutical companies, then you actually start to think about customer 360 from the perspective of the business. So a lot of healthcare companies are what we call B2B, right? So understanding how to be able to, really sell a product to a business where there is very complex parts within a business data context. It's not just about transactional data. It's not just about the data of their first name and last name, but really understanding the different layers within the organization. That's where we're seeing really good benefit, where you can actually build out this account view, this business view 360, which is ultimately where B2B is starting to get really big gains on, because traditionally, a lot of the sales techniques that are done in pharmaceuticals is done in person. But as it's been demonstrated through COVID and through the last three years, that ability to account manage face-to-face and execute the sale is a lot harder. So therefore, how do you pivot away from that? That's where they've come and said, well, we need to build out this business 360 view for us to be able to rely less on the in-field team and be able to be a bit smarter in how we do things. And I think that's really demonstrated in the ability to, reduce that data prep. That data prep percentage of 72.5, I think, is one of the highest kind of reductions we've seen because of how, immature their data prep has been, because they've been focusing so much about the in-field team, that even the smallest increase, in terms of efficiency is really making the biggest gains. And that's why it's really important to think about customer 360 outside of the standard industries that you would think about.
Yeah. I would say the other one that, and that, kind of the B2B side also speaks to what I said at the beginning. I mean, it is very clear. Customers are asking us, I want to share data across lines of business. I want to share data across, different product teams. And I know I mentioned CPG, but that is equally as resonant as regards to like a company that's selling multiple different types of services or products to different businesses, being able to kind of share that data. The last one that I just wanted to bring everyone's attention to was kind of on the retail side. Specifically the 49.9% improvement in time to decision to an individual customer. I think this speaks really, really strongly to the ability to scale like personalization in real time, right? So for a retailer to be able to deliver in real time, whether that's within a browser or what have you, the ability to decision for that customer, or we see this in the Amazon world all the time. These are the other products that somebody might have bought. These are the other recommendations that we could, that we believe would be beneficial to you. Decisioning at the individual level and the speed with which you can do that has such a profound impact on retail. It's not surprising to me to see that kind of listed here as retail being number one in that KPI. Another area that we found like really interesting in this study itself was the cross-functional use. So our hypothesis with this benchmark was really around, the value. So all of these business metrics that we're talking about, those organizations that have taken the customer 360, that unified view, and they apply it across multiple functions, and then they leverage it across multiple functions, is really incurred by those organizations that are not just keeping it in a silo. For example, just keeping it in marketing. So we explicitly asked this question, with regards to, what are some of the kind of business functions, engagement channels that are leveraging your customer 360? So I think here, not surprising, I thought this might be switched. Marketing might be first, then maybe customer support. But you can see here, for the most part, customer support kind of leads with regards to the contributor of the customer 360, as well as the consumer of that information. And I think that makes, again, like a lot of sense with regards to why, right? If I'm servicing a customer, it's really important, particularly to understand context, not just context of the offers that they've received or the emails I've sent them, but context in terms of what was the channel that they were in before they called the call center? What was it that they were trying to do on a website before they initiated a chatbot to engage in some kind of support? So support really has really kind of the leading, I guess I would say, business function with regards to this. The other things I found really interesting, are really kind of these, deeper within the organization use cases. For example, the products and services. Like this is a very clear-cut example for connected devices. So the more connected our devices become, that is the customer footprint. It's not the footprint of a demographic necessarily or a psychographic, but it is the digital footprint of how they are engaging with and with your services or your products. So that was actually very, enlightening. And I actually thought it might have a little bit higher of a percentage. So I think there's an opportunity there. But Jason, just love to get your thoughts on this and kind of where you see any other trends with regards to these functions.
Yeah, so I think the big one really is around supply chain. And if you think about supply chain being relatively low, I think that's more reflective in terms of the organizational structure of how they use data. And I think supply chain traditionally is one of those areas where it's offloaded into a centralized environment. Usually it's an ERP system that the customer would be using. And ERP systems traditionally wouldn't have a lot of customer data that you would want to pipe into a customer 360. So I think this is more reflective in terms of the organization maturity of not understanding, again, where their data is. But we are seeing that the trend is actually moving towards using customer data to be able to further use cases in supply chain. So for example, being able to ship your products through the supply chain, not only from a manufacturing point of view of having all of the origin materials to manufacture the good is critical, particularly if you're an organization that manufactures products at scale, but also understanding when you ship that out to the customer, if you can meet the actual timelines of that order. And in order for you to do that, you need to have that holistic view of the materials that come in, whether or not that's a delay. And if you know that there's a delay in that single customer view, then you would then be able to communicate back to that customer that there might be a delay. And that then allows you to resolve any potential problems as you delay that decision further to talk to that customer. So a lot of the use cases that we're finding is actually taking that logistics information and then being able to then put that in as part of the sales cycle, or at least understanding where you've had problems in the logistics chain in the past, so that the next time you talk to that customer or business, you'll be able to advise them. So a lot of use cases are around that. Another area as well, before I finish, around supply chain is a lot of companies are going to be using third-party providers. And this is where you have what we call 3PL logistics providers, where they effectively won't be sharing data with that company on a normal level. But what we're finding with the marketing stack is this prevalence of what we call data clean rooms, where we invite third-party providers to be able to send their data to collaborate with the customer so that you can create a customer 360-degree view that is beneficial for the third party as well as the first party. So again, this 49% is probably a little bit of a red herring. Hopefully, as the technology and the data develops, then we're going to be able to find more benefits that are intrinsically linked with the supply chain department.
Another use case that, just kind of on that supply chain note, another use case that's starting to, we've seen in auto, is the use of, when somebody does a car configurator, and, just being able to use that data and all of the, kind of specifications and the features and the customizations, and using that for demand planning, right? So how can you take something like that's really early in maybe the consideration cycle and use that to inform your demand planning from a supply chain standpoint? So I think, to your point, Jason, I think this is definitely like maybe a red herring. There's more opportunities to explore there, and I'm really excited to see where that goes. So before we talk about the next, kind of data point, I just wanted to also kind of share. So we talked at the beginning, Matt shared with you a little bit around the demographic. So we were looking at organizations that had over $500 million in revenue. We were looking to be a director level or above to respond to this survey or to our benchmarking study. And then, they also had to have, like, for example, 5 different systems with which are contributing to this unified view of the customer. So there were some prerequisites there. One of the ways that we dissected this data, though, is we really wanted to understand outside of the fact that they have a customer 360 in place, it was how the customer 360 was built. And this was very much predicated around this idea of not a lot of companies necessarily have a 360-degree view. That's a stat shared by Gartner. But many of those who have a customer 360 view, as you see in this slide, 44% of those respondents have said that it's located in a customer data platform. Customer data platforms are absolutely, a huge area of focus, a large area of investment. Look at any kind of stat that you want. You'll see the growth in those types of platforms. And they really represent there's very specific and tangible value that comes from a CDP. So our question was going to be more around, for all of these organizations and those getting these KPIs, what was the build? And we really were able to identify two core segments, and the next slide and some of the later slides will kind of think about these segments more specifically. But we wanted to understand and delineate those people who bought either best of breed, which means it's a third-party application, but it's multiple third-party applications. So I want best of breed of marketing automation. I want best of breed of call center. I want best of whatever those things are, right? So they've selected to make purchases of best of breed applications, or maybe someone who looked at a single vendor. MDMs came up very commonly in this kind of benchmarking study. Like the MDM for them serves as the kind of unified view of the customer. Or for those who decided to do some of their building on any type of cloud platform. So we weren't necessarily looking at public, it could be private cloud, any of the above, but so this idea of buy versus build. And so we were able to, when we kind of look at those dimensions of the data provided, we were finding two segments. So the first one is what we call composite. So 46% of the respondents fall into this composite segment. And what that means is that they did a combination of buy and build. Of whatever, again, it doesn't matter in this case, what was the cloud? It was just a buy of some element and a build of some element. So that's our first segment. So that's our composite segment. The second segment that we looked at, 54% of the respondents fell into this, where it was either a buy or a build. So they could have decided to buy all third-party applications, enterprise applications, or they exclusively built. So for the purposes of the next slide, I wanted to set this framework because it's important to recognize this is a very specific, I guess, microsegmentation of all of the data. Thus far, we've been sharing everything in aggregate, but now we're going to look at two segments very distinctly. And so what we learned in our benchmarking study is that, again, if we go back to some of the original slides, everybody saw improvements really on all of the KPIs. At this point, we just have great data with regards to, for auto, what was the average, return on marketing spend? For travel and hospitality, what was the change in NPS? So we've got some really good benchmarking data. But now let's layer in this idea of how the customer 360 technology stack was done. Was it a buy or a build? And so what we found in this particular, in the data, it showed that for very specific KPIs, those of churn, profit margin, average order value, and customer satisfaction, those organizations that chose a composite approach, which again is a buy and build, outperformed those that just bought or those that just built. And you can see the differences in those numbers here. So again, everybody improved, but there was a significant difference with regards to the incremental improvements through a composite versus that of just a buy or build. So Jason, I'd love to get some of your initial thoughts on, what you think might be driving this type of output.
Sure. So what's quite interesting is that, as we discussed before, a lot of customers would potentially have really good first-party data. So for them, it would make sense to really double down on that composite build where they can really leverage off a best of breed or best of both worlds, as opposed to either doing it all themselves or going to a third party and doing it all. And I think that really reinforces the point of a composite build is where you've got some level of skills within the organization to really make a big difference in that data that you own. And then you can then send that to a third party to do a little bit of what we call the undifferentiated heavy lifting and shifting, to really then get to a much better value or uplift compared to if you were to do one or the other. And I think what's quite clear is that a lot of what we're seeing here is that the uplift is very much at that customer level. How do you really drive that single customer view to be better than if you were to simply have, a black box algorithm do it for you, or alternatively have a dedicated data science team doing it. So I think, if anything, this kind of reflects in terms of your ability to invest the time to actually use the data. And if you can, you will get better value out of that composite versus one or the other.
Yeah, great. I think that closes us off on the business KPIs. Matt, do you want to kind of take us into the efficiencies, the operational efficiency section?
Jeff here, I'll talk maybe
Jeff,
just
okay,
very
sorry.
briefly to set the stage. We're going to jump around a bit. So along with looking at the outcome, the KPIs, and then understanding also what was their overall approach, it turns out that we have to understand actually how did they do it? What are the practices and how do they create both sustainable types of systems and approaches operationally to get the value and sustain that over time? So we evaluated up to over 18 what we would call practices that will give us a sense. And you can see on the screen here, it's really broken up into about 6 categories. What are the data sources and types? So how do you select, how do you ensure, and how many are you using? How do you ensure that you can actually get to that personalized content specific experience, as Lisa tied earlier into one of her kind of value points that she made? So across all of these, we wanted to understand, based on the KPIs, their outcome and performance, based on whether they were a composite or more of a build buy, then which of these practices were also then driving towards that impact. And so as we get into the next few slides, we're going to see how application and using these really does create greater value.
Excellent. So again, I think maybe just to kind of anchor a little bit more, on what you were saying there, Jeff, with regards to the approach. So we didn't just ask a question on, for example, my organization's customer 360 profiles includes data from both structured and unstructured data. That wasn't just a yes, no. We really looked at some of these questions and we had a spectrum of maturity, if you will. So again, this is just an example to share with you on how these questions were proposed. So in this case, maybe you have someone who, we have structured data that's appended to a profile, but we don't necessarily persist it. All the way through, we're collecting structured data and unstructured data, and we are persisting that data within the customer profile itself. So again, just recognizing that within each of those 18 domains that Jeff just talked about, there really, in some ways, there's an element of maturity where we consider that kind of 4th tier or that 5th tier in some of the cases of the questions to be the most mature with regards to the implementation. So again, this isn't just a yes, no, as much as it's also kind of the maturity of the implementation. And one of the things I do just want to clarify here too on the persisted, when we think about Customer 360 at AWS, persistence of having those changes, understanding state changes, and then being able to kind of maintain that is really a key differentiator when it comes to building a Customer 360. And the reason for that is, we do recognize the need for capturing real-time events and then activating on that event, give in real time based on something that a customer has done, whether that's, downloading something from your website or installing your app, right? So we certainly recognize that. But if we think about a customer lifecycle holistically, right, it's made up of a plethora of different events that either they engage in or that maybe the service does to them on their behalf. So being able to capture and then kind of persist that insofar as we don't lose the fact that that happened in the customer's life cycle with us. We also recognize maybe there's some kind of state change that happens. Persistence of that information, at least from AWS, we found to be kind of really compelling with regards to this journey analytics. All right, so again, the purpose of this slide was really just to set up for you, everybody. This is not just about yes or no, it's also an element of maturity. So let's go into the first one. With regards to yeah.
I was just going to add to that, Lisa, as we look at this, we really then say, what's the best practice? And on that maturity spectrum that you see for each of those practices, as you look at those that had a prevalence of being on the top end of that scale, more mature, more competency and capable, that's where we now are going to draw out what that drove as far as the outcomes.
Yeah. So Jason, do you want to take this first one with regards to personalization and contextualization?
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting to kind of see that, one of the big areas that we're finding with best practice with business outcomes is personalization. And that's because when it comes to Customer 360, understanding your customers better, understanding that single row is ultimately going to allow marketeers and the e-commerce teams to be able to provide better messaging, to be able to really drive better personalization, particularly around the journey analytics, around the ability for you to pinpoint particular events during the customer cycle that are really relevant to them. So I think certainly, you know, it's not surprising that this is really the first one, you know, on the list. But Lisa, what did you find out of personalization as well?
Yeah, I really think it's exactly what you said with regard to the journey and why the context is so important here, right? Context helps me understand the customer's mindset. Context helps me understand what that customer might have been doing prior to calling the call center. Context helps me understand what is it that they're trying to search and find if I'm, you know, trying to improve a search experience. Context in my mind is really partly, it's the personalization of it, but then the contextualization in order to drive personalization. I guess I see that as, you know, kind of really kind of marrying of two very important technologies. And so for that reason, I totally agree with you. Like, this is why this particular implementation approach has a very high correlation to all of those KPIs that you see on the side. So this is what Jeff was trying to allude to, this correlation between the maturity of your implementation and how heavily does that correlate to the ability to generate the highest level of KPIs. And this one very specifically, personalized contextual experiences drives, you know, has a correlation to profit margin, order value, cost to resolve, all of those that you see listed. So I think this one is pretty, you know, I think we all probably inherently might have thought like this would be one that would be at the top, but this definitely, I think, kind of, you know, puts that argument to bed. Absolutely, personalization and contextualization leads to higher business outcomes.
Right.
Yeah,
And just real quick, I just wanted to add that for when we considered the best practice, we looked at almost every time and always as part of the best practice. And ultimately, yes, the ones that were doing it all the time were ahead of the almost every times, but that they were lumped together as for the calculations.
Gotcha. Thank you for clarifying that, Matt. Okay, so let's go to the next one. So again, what we're thinking about here is the correlation of the implementation, the maturity of that implementation, and its kind of correlation to business outcomes. The second one that percolated or we saw a high correlation is really this mastery over customer identity. Now, in this case, we actually looked at this through a slightly different lens, which was, you know, can you scale that identity resolution? How confident are you that you have resolved those identities? Are you doing it in a compliant way? How persistent is that identity as the customer traverses through additional channels and or introduces a new ID? So from this perspective, we were trying to understand, you know, for an organization who might have mastery of 1 or 4 of these kind of five domains, those that had mastery of all of them, at least they self-proclaimed to have mastery of all 5 of them, had a really high correlation to business outcomes. And I would say, again, if I had to kind of guess which of those had higher correlation, identity absolutely would have been on the top for me. What about you, Jason?
Yeah, I'd say I'd echo that. I think one area around customer identity is not just the ability for you to persist, you know, at a one point in time, which is kind of what previous companies have done with MDMs and master data management, but it's the ability for you to continually refresh that customer identity regardless of the types of data sources that are piped into that. And I think it's very clear that if you can master, you know, the scale and the accuracy, you know, particularly those two, then you really be able to then push the boundaries in terms of that business. Because as I said before, there's always going to be different areas within the organization that don't feel as though that they have customer data. But if you're able to pipe them in to master that data with other traditional customer data elements, then when you output that customer identity, then inherently the feedback loop allows those other parts of the organization to benefit from that. So you effectively are able to double drop into that pot of benefits, where not only do you get the benefits of the traditional parts of the organization, but the areas that are underserved will also get business benefits as well. And that's really echoed in terms of the uplift that we're seeing with the business outcomes mapped to the mastery of the customer identity, is the ability for these companies to really understand where their data is.
Yeah, and I think, Jason, if you just building on that one step further, if you get mastery of the data, it builds the trust and then the ability to use it with confidence across the business, because that, if it's not there, they're going to be more hesitant to innovate with new ways to apply that data to better customer experience, sales, the cycle time reduction, et cetera. So this is almost foundational to all of those outcomes that we saw and talked about earlier.
Absolutely
Yeah, really
right.
good point.
Yeah. So then I guess our third, again, what were those implementations that were kind of highly correlated to business outcomes? And the last really showed up as real time. So, I mean, there's, again, no denying the need for having as most real-time accurate view of the customer profile at any given time versus any type of latency, because how can you deliver on experience when you have, old, archived, incorrect data? So again, I wouldn't say this was a huge surprise, but again, just to kind of more definitive, we absolutely know that real time is compelling. It's important for driving business outcomes.
Yeah, really good call out. I think it's interesting that number 1 and 3 are very similar when you think about it. But actually, what really sets apart number 1 with the personalization is that not only are we saying that you're able to personalize and contextualize, but you're able to do that not just for the one customer, but for many. So if here in this slide, the real-time profile might be relevant for that one customer in that journey analytics of presenting the right contextualized offer at the point in time that they're at your website, using the example of e-commerce. Yes. But the reason why number 1 is number 1 is if you can then lift out all of those attributes and then scale that into segmentation analysis, then you can then start to identify the different types of other customers that look like that one customer that just purchased something. And that's why if you do have the time to look at some of the slides, or look at this recording a little bit later on, you'll find that some of the business benefits of number 1 includes customer lifetime value. And that's because understanding the context at a scalable level, understanding it for all customers really drives benefits, not just for that one customer, but for everyone.
Absolutely. Great. So I think the last and very compelling, at least from an AWS perspective, we also did an analysis just to understand kind of the correlations between, implementation maturity, business outcomes. We just walked through that. But one of the areas that we found to be even more interesting is that the presence of AWS in some of those accounts. So again, we asked, what was the build? What did you build on? Was it a public cloud? Was it a private cloud? Can you share with us what is the public cloud? What is the cloud of preference? So we were able to capture kind of a subset of that was in fact AWS. And you can see here for several of the KPIs that we were looking at, whether that's churn reduction, customer lifetime value improvements, return on marketing spend, those that had AWS present saw an incremental improvements even over those that were private cloud or public cloud or none of the above. So I think, again, really strong, compelling business case for AWS, obviously. But I think just nonetheless, there's a lot of advantages of having cloud, having a secure cloud, and being able to drive some of these outcomes. This is kind of holistically what AWS, our approach towards, kind of this maturity of building a customer 360, starting with that unified persistent profile. Absolutely next to that is around identity resolution. If you haven't resolved the identity confidently, scalably, consistently, you're going to not necessarily be able to drive. You're personalizing to someone who isn't necessarily the person you think they are. So kind of customer profile and identity resolution really kind of get coupled together. Then we think you kind of lend yourself into the next stage of maturity, which is enriching and enhancing that profile, whether that be through enriching it with data from third party or second party, or the data clean room that Jason mentioned earlier, or even enhancing that profile using AI and ML to infer or derive new data about that customer. So that would be kind of the third leg of this maturity curve. Sensing and responding in real time. Obviously, that segment of 1 that Jason talked about, the ability to act on that data and treat an individual as an individual is critically important. And then kind of contextualizing the decision making. This is where we start to introduce kind of this idea of the customer data and the customer profile has extensions into other parts of the business, somewhat like the supply chain that we talked about, or the products, the IoT devices. It isn't just your traditional customer data. It's really kind of extending much further into the enterprise. So I think with that, we are kind of at the end. So I don't know, Matt or Jeff, if you wanted to kind of close us off here.
It looks like there might be some questions as well, Matt. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, there is a question, but it's about the slides. So I'll say a few things here. You know, as we've talked about, and thank you, Lisa and Jason and Matt for sharing, but ultimately looking at this holistically, understanding not just what the impact is, but understanding the approach, the blend of solutions, looking at it across the critical mass definitely has an impact. So what best practices and how many of those you're applying, what the approach is, whether it's composite, whether it's buy, it has an impact here. So it gives you some food for thought to say, if we're looking to optimize the return on investment for the technology spend and how that fits back into core business outcomes that all of our business leaders care about, then looking at this holistically and now looking for a more composite and broad ranging solution has a huge gain. You may see only a few percentage point differences, but that can correlate into tens of millions of dollars annually, and that really impacts the bottom line. You know, we've shared, and I think that beyond this, there is a white paper that a link is provided in the slides here, where you can go and see a little bit more information behind what we presented today, and that is hosted by AWS. So you're welcome to go and follow that link. The one question that came through already was, where can I get the slides? So after the end of the webinar today, we'll capture the recording, and that will be posted on APQC's website in the near future. There'll also be a follow-up email that provides you access to how to get to the slides and have a copy of the information and visit that recording in the future. So those are some of the things that will help you to not only take what you've heard today, but now have access and use that and spread the information across your organizations.
Yeah, one final takeaway that I'd probably also say here is that a lot of what you've seen here in terms of the output is really around business value drivers. And one of the takeaways that I would recommend for any customers is that if you can identify the business value driver and also the use cases that power that through a customer 360 foundation, then maybe start small around that use case. And don't try and tackle the entire use case and then understand if a build or buy or a composite approach is best for you. Try and actually start from something which is a small slice of that use case, and then test and learn, and then understand if composite build or buy is the right approach. It's not something that you need to set off straight away as an organization to commit to that for the end of time, because certainly the commitment of a customer data platform could be quite costly. So that's my recommendation, is to work backwards from that use case, understand the smaller slice of that, and then see what comes out of that to be able to generate the value metrics that you're seeing here on the presentation.
Right, and that is something that we did find, and it was expounded on in the white paper a little bit, is that based on the timing and maturity and all, you know, we did see that there were early in the journey, organizations did go with it, maybe a point solution as a best of breed or something like that. So that's right in line with what Jason was just talking about. There's a couple questions came through real quick before we run out of time. The link to the white paper will be part of the slides that will be made available to the participants. So you can't click on it obviously through the webinar right now, but when you get a copy of the slides through your email, you'll have access to that white paper. So with that, I think we're just about out of time here. So I appreciate Lisa and Jason for all your insight and your contribution. And thank you all that participated and attended the webinar. And I guess at this point, Nikki, you can go ahead and shut us down.